For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and his children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, he said, "Pay what you owe." Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay him the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all the debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave, as I had mercy on you?" And in his anger, his lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother or sister from their debt.
So we have been working with Jesus' parables in this worship series, specifically to look at places where we can gain skills on how to deal with people that are uncomfortable to be around, maybe. Also, what would be known as difficult people. Do you all have those in your lives? Yes. There you go. Somebody said I am one. Okay, the sermon's over. Thank you for that. All the different parables help us not only to see how we might be able to live life in a way that helps us develop those skills to get along better with all people, but also be able to see where God works mysteriously in the midst of all that relationship, and how Jesus shows us a way of life that leads us into places that we may not necessarily go on our own. This particular parable is the unforgiving servant that we're looking at today. And it depicts, like you just heard today, it's got a king in the story who, without a second thought, forgives an outrageous debt that is legally owed to them. They don't just willy-nilly throw away the little debts and collect the big ones. This was a really, really, really big one that just gets dismissed. And then you have the unforgiving servant who, having just been forgiven, turns around and is unable to forgive a fellow servant and a very minor debt in comparison. So as we move forward, it's really helpful to not only think about this story that we just heard, but a couple of the verses just before this story help explain why Jesus is even talking about this. This is the question that Peter gives in the verses 21 and 22 of chapter 18, where he says, "Then Peter came and said to him, 'Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?' Jesus said to him, 'Not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times.'" So this parable for Jesus is all about forgiveness, how we receive it and how we give it away. This is about being able to see that our relationship with God is grounded in this very forgiveness, and how that groundedness in that relationship helps us then to turn around and be forgiving even an inordinate amount of times to people in our own lives. This is where this question is coming from. So we're talking first about the king himself. The king in this parable is an incredibly benevolent king. How many kings have you ever seen depicted in movies that are this generous? Right? Maybe once? One? None? None. Okay, none. All right. Well, Monty Python never depicts anybody that way, and that's what I watch mostly. But It's really, one or two. I mean, Robin Hood's king, the Lion King, right? Those are benevolent kings, right? So it does happen. It's not that it's not possible, but usually what we see is a king who has overtaxed the peasants, have made people live in squalor for their own selfishness and their own greed, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing I think of when I think of kings. So when I hear about this kind of a king in these parables, I'm thinking, man, that completely disrupted what my expectation of kings is all about, which is why Jesus tells parables. Jesus speaks in parables in order to disrupt what it is that we think we know, in order to provide some space for learning something new, for maybe possibly looking at something from a different perspective so that a new possibility emerges. So if we can have certain stereotypes about what kings are in our life, and we see something like this where a king is incredibly benevolent, outrageously benevolent, then maybe our stereotypes can be broken down and we can start to imagine something different. New possibilities emerge and a new way of living comes about when we let go of our stereotypes and our expectations. So this is one of the ways that Jesus starts out by doing this, right? So now we know about this king. What about the debt? The debt that is owed to the king by the servant is 10,000 talents. Now a talent is an amount of money that is equal to about 130 pounds of silver, which translated would take a laborer 15 years to pay off. Now there's 10,000 of these talents that is owed. That means 150,000 years of labor. Just sit with that for a bit. How many people are actually alive for 150,000 years? This is an outrageous debt. This is just an over-exaggeration. It is something that can never, ever in a lifetime, even in a string of lifetimes of generations of the same family, you could never expect to pay this debt back. And everyone that heard this parable knew that. They knew it was an exaggeration and that it could never actually take place. So that speaks to the benevolence of this king. There is no way that this particular servant could ever repay this debt. But the king just wipes it out without a second thought. And this is one servant. How many other servants in the kingdom probably owed the king a similar debt? A benevolent king. Who knew? Right? So this amazing gift that has been given this servant should just rock this person's world, right? It should completely change their life, which is exactly what Jesus is going for in these parables. When Eric introduced this series last week, he was talking about how Jesus was introducing a completely new way of being in the world. It wasn't just words that you should maybe hope for in your life, but actually live into being this person in the world. And he's pointed to Matthew 22 and said, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your mind." And this is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So the four loves, or the three great loves that are introduced by that passage is the love of God, the love of neighbor, and the love of self. And Eric introduced the fourth G on that, which was grace. And this grace idea is added to all those loves that enable all that love. It's that unearned love and respect and forgiveness from God to us that is given to us in the very nature of creation itself. Not just to humanity, but the entirety of the whole of creation. It is bound up in it. There's no way to escape it. It's who we are. It's the very foundation of our identity. It's who God created us to be. This is grace. And in our particular parable today, that grace is translated into the word forgiveness. How we receive it and how do we give it away. Grace and forgiveness in this particular thing is the same thing. It's where God breaks open possibilities by giving us an unimaginable gift in the very being of who we are that allows us to recognize that in other people and clear out all the stuff that gets in between us so that we can love one another and live in life most fully as we were created to be. That's Jesus' message about this king in this parable. So I'm asking you to start thinking about a time during our music here when you have been given an extreme, outrageous gift. And how did you respond to receiving that gift? How did it change your way of life? Did it change your way of life? Have you ever been impossibly forgiven? And what did that do to how you responded to the rest of the world?
As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you.
So we've talked a little bit about the king and the outrageous gift that is given to each and every one of us, as well as to the unforgiving servant. So now we need to take a look at this unforgiving servant and see what's going on here with this person. This person has walked away from a debt that would have crippled him for his life and his entire family for generations to come. And yet, when met with a fellow servant, somebody who shares his same kind of standard of living, and he knows what life is like for this other person, where it's really hard to come up with any extra money whatsoever to be able to even repay debts to friends, much less to those who are threatening you, right? So where is the grace in the relationship between the servants in this scenario? And what's happening here? What's Jesus trying to tell us about this relationship among each other? It helps to understand that the monetary value of this second debt that we're talking about is much smaller than the first one. When we're talking in the first one about the debt, it's about talents, which is a larger scale of money to begin with, and then there were 10,000 of them. In this particular story, we're talking about denarii, which is a lesser amount, and there's only 100 of them. And one denarii, or one denarius, is considered 1 day's wage. So if you have 100 that you owe, then you owe 100 days of labor to somebody. So that's doable, right? Absolutely. You might owe 15,000 people that same amount, but it's doable, one debt at a time. I've been spending a lot of time over the last couple of years trying to properly work with my money. I'm terrible at it. So I've got this budget that I've set up, and I've been working with it, trying to narrow down my debt so that decisions that I make in the future won't be made based on money, but rather based on what I want to do and what brings me most fully joyful in my life. And so I know it's possible to do, but it takes a long time. And for 100 days of labor, even though it's incredibly less than the first debt, it still is a debt, and it still is something that's going to be a struggle for this second servant to have to do. So we've got this person that has just been made free from all of the struggles in their life and for their generations to come in their family, and yet for this little amount, they can't see their way through to forgive. So that's my struggle with this particular parable. Who do you identify with in all the characters that are here in this story? Even on my best days, I don't think I could ever compare myself to the king. How about all of you? It's a little bit harder, right? Forgiveness is a very difficult thing to do. So to be able to be so freely, amazingly outrageous with your forgiveness seems almost otherworldly. So even on my best days, it's hard to identify with the king. And yet we have this unforgiving servant who has no gratitude for what he's just been given, this amazing gift, enough so to turn around and treat other people badly. So I don't really want to be that first servant either, right? I mean, I have days, if I'm honest, where I'm not as loving and compassionate and forgiving as I could be, but I really hope that I also have days where I am. So identifying with the unforgiving servant seems a bit extreme too, I hope, at least for me. So maybe it's that second servant who does legally owe a debt and is in fact working towards maybe trying to repay it little by little at a time. Maybe that's the character I can identify with. But honestly, Doesn't it seem that the way that the parable is set up, that even the second servant is a little resentful? The fact that the first servant is calling in a debt when he knows his situation and he can't pay it? There's still resentment there too. Is it really any better than being compared to the unforgiving servant? Probably not. Which is why I have a problem with this parable. Where do I fit into that? How do I compare myself? The only reason why I like the second servant is because I can point to the first one and say, I'm not that bad, right? All of us don't like to think of ourselves as being the one that's the worst. And in this particular series, we're talking about the uncomfortable neighbor. But what happens if the reversal in this particular parable is exactly what was hinted at earlier? What if we're the uncomfortable neighbor? The one that is, in fact, not taking compassion and pity on our neighbors, not taking into consideration who they are and what their situation is all about. What if we're the ones that can't bring ourselves to say we're sorry? What if we're the ones that don't notice the impact on the rest of the world through our neglect? What if what Jesus is saying is that we ourselves often are that uncomfortable neighbor that others have trouble relating to? That puts a whole spin on the situation and makes my discomfort even larger. I have a colleague in the Lutheran Church whose name is David Lose. He was a speaker with us on Darkwood Brew a couple of times here at Countryside, and he now is a senior pastor at a big, large church in Minneapolis. He was a president of a seminary. He's done all kinds of stuff, but moreover, he's a good writer. And he wrote a commentary on this parable, and he writes, "My difficulty with this passage has quite simply been that forgiveness can be so exceptionally difficult, and never more so than when it is commanded. I don't mean the occasional moment of warm-hearted forgiveness overlooking someone's minor slight when you feel magnanimous." I had to practice that all weekend. "Nor do I mean the spontaneous forgiveness you feel when someone is genuinely contrite over some accidental, and again preferably minor, fault. What I mean are those things that are really hurtful. Those times when the person seems disinclined to take responsibility, let alone apologize. Those episodes that continue to wound each time you remember them. Those words or deeds that have marked you deeply and painfully and feel like they'll never go away. Those are things that are so incredibly hard to forgive." That's the level of the king forgiveness, right? Not only when you have felt pain so deep that you feel like it'll never go away, but even people that you know and love are hurt by a situation that you might be able to forgive them for the pain they caused you, but the pain they've caused someone you love, I think that's even harder. I can't, even on my best days, remember always how possible it is to be able to forgive in that situation. So my only choice seems to be to identify with the unforgiving servant, who even at times when I can forgive, there are also going to be a lot of times when the pain is too great and forgiveness seems so far away. So who am I called to be in this parable? Who is Jesus asking me to be in this way of life that opens up possibilities for relationships even when you didn't think there was one? What is Jesus trying to tell me to be about in these situations where the pain is too deep and it's so incredibly hard to be the one who's forgiving, even if you are already forgiven yourself? Lowes continues, Amid my despair at ever being able to forgive the way the king in the parable forgives, it occurs to me that I don't have to. That's not really what Jesus is asking. I don't have to identify with the king in this story. I can identify with the servant with a massive debt who has just been forgiven so much. Which means that my first job isn't to assume or insist that I must forgive incalculable debts, but simply to bask in the unbelievable forgiveness, acceptance, and grace that I have experienced, and try as much as I can to live out of that. The failure of the first servant isn't simply that he won't forgive his comrade, but that he has just experienced an utterly unexpected, completely beyond his wildest dreams, life-changing moment of grace, and seems absolutely untouched by it. And for this reason, he lives devoid of any sense of gratitude, and his whole life changed, and he didn't even notice. That sounds a little bit more like me. How often do we walk through life without understanding or realizing that we walk by grace, in gratitude for a God that loves us so deeply, that this grace and forgiveness and this unearned, undeserved love is the very ground of the being we're walking on? How often are we even aware of that? And how are we letting the possibilities that that gives us change the way we act in the world, change the way we receive the world, change who we are in the world? Most of the time we don't even notice. And that is almost unforgivable. Yet God does. And that's who we all are. We all have possibility now because of God. Even when we don't notice, God notices us and makes ways for us that were never open before. Gives us a strength of love and support from others that we are then able to reach out and be love and support for other people. So the freedom that we're given in this love of God allows us to let go of all those blockages that we have that stand in our way of being in relationship to God, ourselves, and to one another. And in that freedom then, possibility exists that even when we don't think it's ever remotely possible for us to forgive, it actually is possible. And it can happen. And that's exactly what Jesus is calling us to be forgiving people even when it's most difficult. Jesus forgave even on the death of a cross. Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do. Even to death on a cross, forgiveness is possible for all of us. We can all be forgiving people. So how do we live in a world of forgiveness? Where do we see it among us? We have all kinds of examples all around us all the time. Victims of child abuse, victims of sex trafficking abuse, victims of killings in schools. Sandy Hook, the parents of the folks at Sandy Hook, publicly stood up and forgave the perpetrator. The victims of the family, the friends and family of the victims of Charlottesville shooting, people gathered together in Bible study with one another, where someone came in and opened fire. They stood up and publicly forgave that boy. We see it around us all the time. It is possible, even in the midst of our pain, our suffering, our grief. God makes that possible. Jesus tells us it is possible. That we even yearn for that possibility is something that God gives us. That's who we are as forgiven people. We move forward forgiving others, even when we don't think we can. That's what we're called to be. And in that, perhaps we can find that everyone else around us seems a lot more comfortable because we're a lot more open to the possibility of relationship with them. They're not so uncomfortable neighbors anymore. Knowing our own outrageous gift that we've received, we're able to be more open to that gift in other people. And just maybe, perhaps, we ourselves are a lot more comfortable to be around. Amen. Jesus, in the night in which he was betrayed, offered forgiveness to all those around him. As he sat at the table with the disciples, he broke bread and gave it to them, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And again after supper he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to all to drink, saying, "This blood is the new covenant in my love, shed for you and for all people, for the forgiveness of debt, to free you to walk a new path, to open ways that were never opened before, to provide possibility in your lives. Even unto the cross, forgiveness is made possible and happens every day. This is the gift that we receive when we come together for this meal. You don't have to be a member or believe any of the things I just said to be here with us. But we bring all of our burdens, all of our scars, all of our fears, all of our pain, all of our grief, as we stand here together in a community, forgiving one another and finding a way to walk through that door and keep forgiving everyone else we meet. This is where it begins, God's love for us. I invite our servers forward to prepare the meal. And as they're coming forward, let us speak together our words of what it means to be in community with one another. We are an inclusive, open, and affirming family of faith, welcoming all to God's table of love and acceptance. We are diverse, yet united by Christ's example. We care for one another, support one another, and challenge one another to become all that God creates us to be. We work together to nurture our community and to promote peace and justice in our conflicted world. These are the gifts of God for the people of God. Please come.